On behalf of the Council for World Mission and on behalf of the eDARE team, I welcome to the 8th session of eDARE 2021. I can't look into the audience, but I welcome each one of you equally. Those who attended previous sessions and those who are joining us for the first time, I extend the same welcome to everyone. And echoing the parable of the laborers, no matter if you came to a previous session or only to this session, no matter if you came early or late, I assure you that you will be given the same presentations in this session. Whether we receive them in the same way is a completely different question, but I welcome you, all of you equally. Namaskaram, ni hao, and greetings. A few housekeeping matters. Please note that the presentations are recorded and they'll be edited and placed in the eDARE webpage later. We post a couple of poll questions on your screen. Please answer those to help us plan our future eDARE events. For questions to the panel, please use the Zoom Q&A feature or the Facebook comment section, and we will gather those during the discussion time. You will find fuller biographies which are being placed on the chat. Biographies of the members of the panel, which is available at the eDARE webpage. Please look there to learn more about their work, their location, their commitments, and other interesting things about the members of the panel. We will begin this session with 3 presentations. The titles of the presentations will also be placed in the chat box. But the first presenter is Patta, and then he will be followed by Lim Chin Ming Stephen. And Stephen's presentation has been pre-recorded, but he's here and he'll be part of the discussion. And then our third presenter is Tat-siong Liew. And they will present for about 8 to 10 minutes. And then after that, we will have a poem read by, the poet is Aruna Gogulamanda, and I'm not sure if she has arrived, but she will then read a poem if she is here, or one of us will read. Her poem is "This is My Country." And then after Aruna's poem, our listener for this session is James Parkinson. Jim will offer a short response to the poem and the presentations, aiming to answer all of the questions that we want to raise, but basically to help us start our discussion and give us some ideas on how we may rethink what we thought we heard from the presenters and the poem. So we will start with the first presentation. The first presentation is by Patta, and he has a PowerPoint that he will show. Raj, welcome.
Thank you, Jione. Thank you, Jione, and thank you, CWM, eDARE, and greetings to you all. My topic is British public liberation theology and an migrant's proposal. Around 30 years ago, in an editorial comment, it was mentioned that it is liberation theology that Britain needs. And things evolved as went on. And as you can see, I am an immigrant living in the UK and trying to engage, because that in itself explains that the British public sphere today is no longer monolithic white Christian, but a combination of several factors, including migration, into a context. The ishness in the British, as I keep engaging and as I say, is how can an immigrant propose a liberation theology to a different context? My being has always been an hyphenated being by myself, by to say Dalit hyphen Christian, Indian hyphen living in Britain, and several things like that. So my being today is a hyphenated identity, and that is one of the factors that makes the composition of the British public sphere. My becoming is I'm forging new identities, because by passport I'm Indian, by residence I'm British, by confession I come from the Lutheran Church, I work with the Methodist Church. So those kinds of new formation of identities. And by belonging, I have multiple belongings. Or at some points I keep thinking, where do I really belong? So all of these really makes this 21st century British public sphere to be diverse, ethnic, and all these hyphenated identities become an important factor in defining the ishness in the British public sphere. To understand further, how do I understand it to be a public theology? I bring in Elaine Graham's understanding, where she tries to say that public theology is about Christian apologetics, in a way trying to defend Christian faith in accountability with the world in which we live. And secondly, it is about speaking truth to the power in the public sphere. And it is also about a continual praxis that we need to see how we can all come together, is what I engage in my paper as I write about it. But to understand further what public theology in the UK is, and where I live currently is a place called Stockport, and the symbol of our town is a frog on a frog. And that really defines me what public theology is. That accountability to the word and to the world makes public theology with an amphibious character of theological understanding. Then I bring into, when I'm trying to engage in bringing what is a British liberation public theology, for me, my theological location of Dalit theology offers that context out of which I am proposing a British liberation theology, because Dalit theology today contests and counters normalizations of any status quo and privilege, and that sanctions oppression and exclusion of any form and every form. And therefore, Dalit theology for me is an engagement with the counter epistemological theological praxis. So that gives me a theological location and positioning in trying to offer a British public liberation theology. And there are several, if I have to analyze the British public sphere today, there are so many factors and so many variables that I need to engage with. But from my social location and from my position, a theological location, I want to bring in three issues of public relevance and try to articulate a British public liberation theology. First is the context of growing hunger within the British society today. And hunger is, as we understand, is very relative. But today, hunger with food banks, with the increase of food banks, it has been 20 years since food banks have come into this context. And hunger is growing and growing with sanctions and welfare state losing its what it has to offer. And so, therefore, the context of 21st century British public sphere is a context of growing hunger. So in such a context, articulating a public theology, it will be a public theology called an anti-hunger theology. And this is where I bring in Bread of Life in Broken Britain by Charles Pemberton, who has articulated what does it mean to have faith in the context of food banks and neoliberalism. And he tries to say, are food banks a solution for hunger today? Because there are several dynamics to understand how food banks have evolved. And there is also a new liberalization of food banks and spirituality. Particularly Christians think by offering some food cans, they are doing a greatest kind of charity, not recognizing that there is a neoliberal chain that goes along with food banks. So Charles Pemberton brings in precariousness as a growth of the risk in these food banks and try to say, if at all, moving forward, participation should be a theological offering. And in doing that, we need to decolonize this neoliberal food banks, and Eucharist offers to be a space critiquing hunger. It is not just coming for a community, but it is a space to critique hunger in a context today. And God is rise is another metaphor symbol that we bring in understanding an anti-hunger theology for 21st century. The second context is the rising or the growth of xenophobia, the fear of the stranger. And when Salman Rushdie says that we live in a new empire, in an old empire, the old empire was the colonial outsiders, but the new empire is the growing colonialism within the public sphere in the British context. So that would be a second context where I propose that we need an anti-empire theology as a British public liberation theology. And I bring in Anthony Reddy's Theologizing Brexit, where he criticizes this theory of exceptionalism to the empire, that they are not chosen ones, but we need to contest this exceptionalism. And we can't go back to Great Britain and greatness is not in showing domination, but it is about power, it is about serving the other. And it is also to understand that there is diversity of Englishness. There are Black English people, there are Asian English people within our context, and we need to celebrate it. And knowledge is no longer power, and power is not knowledge, but we need to nurture those knowledge from the outside, the diverse communities. And growth is also not in numbers and members, particularly within the growth of Black Christianity in the British public sphere. Growth is also when people say there is the church growth has reduced, they only mean by members and numbers, which is again a colonial episteme, because curating growth in diverse forms. It is not just about growing apples, but it is about celebrating growing carrots, spinach, sugarcane, and several other forms of growth. So we need an anti-empire theology as British public liberation theology. And thirdly, the context of growing racial discrimination, where again Anthony Reddy brings in this, we need a contestation of white supremacy. Unless we have a theological engagement, we can't really move forward. And the second thing we see is how people try to say it is not just Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter. Not really knowing when we say that there is an epistemology in Black Lives Matter, which needs to be celebrated, and it is not only all lives matter. And also, is Indian English, English? We need to celebrate against the diversity of Englishness and that prejudice with which how people see. So there is a context of growing racial discrimination, and the proposal is an anti-racist theology, dismantling white supremacy towards a pedagogy of liberation from below, contested epistemologies, nurturing dissent, and racism thrives when privilege is tolerated. So if privilege is not tolerated, racism can be addressed. So on my final slide, what is an implication for us? The implication for us as church is church becomes a site of hospitality. The church is part of the public sphere rather than the public sphere. And subalternity or from outside become an Eucharistic point of theological hospitality. And we are called to celebrate faiths at the table of public sphere in this post-truth age. So these are some of my contributions towards a British public liberation theology today. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. We will come back to the proposals that you have put before us, and what does a British theology look like. And I think this is just testimony to the because we migrate, people migrate, we take our ways of thinking with us. And the British Empire came to our world, and they brought their way of thinking. Now it's our turn to invade the British Empire. So I think this is a good way of getting started. We will move now to Stephen Lim's presentation, which will be played. Thank you.
This essay represents my ongoing effort to do what I've argued elsewhere as reading the Bible from elsewhere. In this respect, Fairoz Ahmad represents the ethnic and religious other in my context in Singapore. More specifically, I attempt to listen to Ruach in the Exodus story through a conception of wind in his book Interpreter of Winds, in hope of rereading this all too familiar tale. I read this story amidst the many authoritarian regimes that have rooted themselves in Asia. In this regard, Joel Baden has outlined that the reception of the Exodus story tends to privilege reading it either in its familial national or social ethical dimensions. Given that I only have 10 minutes, I wish to focus more on the elsewhere that Fairoz Ahmad seems to be taking me on board the currents of the wind. The particular story I look at is entitled The Palace of Glass. It is told from the standpoint of a dog who is trudging across the desert with the help of a camel in search of a cure for his ailing master. The story told by the dog is about a king who lives in a palace of glass, where there's a hall of 1,000 mirrors to reflect the riches of his kingdom to the world. In what would have often been perceived as an impossible moment, the king realizes the temporal nature of his achievements and yearns to pursue knowledge about the world. An opportunity presents itself when his vizier brings him 7 glass jars of different colors. It turns out an angel is refracted through the mirrors in his palace and is now trapped in the 7 jars. In exchange for his release, the king asks that he lives through the age of enchantment, the age of discovery, and the age of decline. The angel grants the king his request. The king's journey through time is marked by his interaction with different winds. His first encounter is on board the ship of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, where he has to safeguard Boreas, the north wind, Notos, the south wind, and Eurus, the east wind, which are secured in a bag by Aeolus, the king of winds. The winds are let loose on account of the greed of the sailors because they have mistaken the king to be holding on to gold. This then destroys the ship. The king is saved by the wind Zephyros. After they part ways, the king would meet Ruach, the Hebrew wind. Ruach preserves him from the fury of the Pharaoh against Moses. Eventually, he lives until the 18th century, where the king is returned to the Palace of Glass by Zephyros. Despite having lived for more than 2,000 years, the king wants to carry on and reneges on his promise. At this moment, Angel Israel comes to rescue the imprisoned angel, whom it is revealed to be Makibat, a guardian angel in Islamic law. Israel pronounces judgment on the king. You learnt about wisdom, but not faith. You learnt the power of God, but not of his mercy. You learnt of illness, but not of pain. You learnt about old age, but not of death. And thus, like the people of art, we sent upon them a Sasa wind, in days of calamity, that we might give them a taste of disgracing torment in this present worldly life. But surely the torment of the hereafter will be more disgracing, and they will never be helped. And how the people of art suffered, so shall you. The angel Makibat is then liberated from the palace of glass, and the hall of 1,000 mirrors is destroyed, leaving only the unbreakable throne, with its dead king as a reminder to all. This story is offered by the dog, who is the chief protagonist, to a figure in the desert called the wind, in exchange for help for his ailing master. In the interest of time, I highlight a few scattered points of reflection. First, following from Israel's pronouncement, both the king and the pharaoh face certain judgment. What is striking to me is the irony that the king has experienced life from below, and the pharaoh, to a lesser extent, also suffers hardship. Yet their ambitions still supersede all other experiences of life. Knowledge has not taught them the limits of life, nor has powerlessness enabled them to exercise power less greedily. Much less suffering and loss dampen their desire for more power. In my view, hardening their hearts is the only way left for those who hang on to power that they have already accrued. Put differently, the Exodus story is as much as making of a great nation as it is the unraveling of one. Read through the Palace of Glass, what is emphasized is that all empires or nations are fragile and will ultimately break. If that were true, what we should learn is to embrace that all kingdoms, in whatever shape and form, will end. And it might be good for all of us to plan for that. Second, my gaze seems to be guided continually back to the dog, who is likely the subaltern in the tales of kings seeking power. It remains hidden, not mentioned at all in its own tale. The absence of the dog reminds me of the relative silence of the Hebrew slaves, or my people, who seem most of the time inert, quiet, and passive. That being said, it is the dog who tells the story, not the king, nor any of the winds, nor even the angels. Similarly, the story of the Exodus is slightly told more by subjugated peoples under empire, As an aside, it seems to me to be fairly ironic that the stories of powerful kings still depend on the subaltern to tell them, to sustain their existence through the generations. Yet, at the same time, the storyteller gains seemingly nothing significant. There is no immediate salvation waiting for the dog as it receives foul-smelling grease and a pair of socks, which end up no more than comfort for his ailing friend Gati the camel, and is treated to tea. It finally returns home to its master without any cure. The tale of an oppressive pharaoh being punished by God is similarly told among many peoples who also likely receive no such salvation. Finally, wind in Fairoz Ahmad's interpreter of winds takes diversely different forms. A force of nature, the breath that carries stories, and even a person. Here I wish to dwell a little longer on the connection to stories. Stories in his tale appear to perform several functions. They could be entertainment for the long dreary trek across the desert. They perform a kind of catharsis by shoring up the hubris of rulers from kings of old to white colonialists. They are gifts to be exchanged which create bonds and friendships. They remind us of worlds beyond ourselves and of beings far greater than ourselves. The other connection Fairoz Ahmad makes is to the human figure in the desert called the wind. As mentioned earlier, the dog does not receive the liberation it seeks, but instead grease, socks, and tea. In my reading, the grease symbolizes how stories can be salved to wounds inflicted by oppression, socks to warm us in times when the world seems so cold, and bitter stories like tea can become increasingly light and refreshing with each retelling. The relief may seem temporary, but it does not make it any less necessary. And just as the dog realizes that ultimately the best way it could save its master is to stay by his side instead of wandering the desert for a cure, the experience of Ruach as salvation through the Exodus story might bestow unexpected kinds of liberations to different peoples. Fairoz Ahmad, through the interpreter of winds, has provoked me to reread the story of Moses bringing the mixed multitudes out of Egypt across the Red Sea that will be deeply embedded in Jewish celebration of the Passover and Christian practice of the Eucharist. Reflecting on how it is often read in the long shadow of Cold War logic of right versus left, I have to honestly contend with the possibility that both a national familiar reading that emphasizes election and a social liberative reading that centers liberation could be potentially acts of putting angels in jars. What would have been otherwise the mundane mixed multitudes have become a spotlight of much attention, so much so that other particulars of the text are being glossed over. As one who has lived in cities all his life, brought up in pro-capitalist Confucian conservative rhetoric in the Singaporean context, and later on exposed to the left-leaning discourses in the West, it would be natural for me that nature takes a back seat, thus completely overlooking how God chooses to communicate through such elemental forces. It is here that reading it with the interpreter of winds has aroused my consciousness, especially when one flips to the back of the book, where it writes, "This book is a celebration of little charms, the enchantments of our universes amid struggles and eventual helplessness."
Stephen is here and he will answer any questions. If you have in the audience and you have a question for Stephen or a comment, please put it in the Q&A. And on that, we move from the dog and the camel to beast. And Benny.
Thank you. I need to learn how to do that from Stephen. It's really impressive. The technology is amazing. But my paper is motivated by the fact that we're now living and working under the reality of an ecological crisis, including what scholars have called the sixth extinction. We can no longer just think and talk about humans rising to life. Because of this reality, I want to perform a particular reading of Matthew's Gospel to help question anthropocentrism. In this reading, I'll basically make four arguments. First, Matthew's Jesus is being presented as a sovereign in the first Gospel. Second, animality is important for Matthew's Jesus to emerge and establish his sovereignty. Third, animality is also crucial for the continuation of Matthew's Jesus' sovereignty. because his sovereignty is in many ways beastly. Fourth and finally, all human claims to sovereignty are in the end misguided. So first, very quickly, Matthew's Jesus as sovereign. Even from its very beginning, Matthew's gospel distinguishes Jesus with regal pedigree and status. In addition to introducing Jesus as the son of King David in Jesus' genealogy, Matthew adds in the birth narrative that Jesus himself has been born king of the Jews, and moves the plot immediately into a duel between sovereigns, in which King Herod dies after failing to eliminate Jesus. As the gospel concludes, Matthew's resurrected Jesus will declare that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. Matthew's Jesus is a sovereign Christ. Now, second, how animality is important for Matthew's Jesus to begin his sovereignty. Questions of animality appears as early as Matthew 3, chapter 3, when John the Baptist appears in the wilderness. Notice the baptizer's appearance, diet, location, and vocation. Wearing clothing of camel hair with a leather belt around his waist, that is, dressed in animal hair and animal skin. John the Baptist comes across as a savage or a man in an animal state. While locusts and wild honey are in keeping with Jewish purity laws, they are, for lack of a better term, raw food that puts John closer to non-human animals, especially given his whereabouts. The presence of the baptizer in the wilderness and around the Jordan, both indicators of geographical and symbolic boundary in biblical literature, puts John on the verge between humanity and animality. But John is also presented as someone who has a special relationship to God's salvation by preparing the way of the Lord. Most significant for me is how Matthew's Jesus, in the words of the baptizer, comes after John, arrives at this boundary region to be baptized by this animal-like prophet, and receive the Holy Spirit descending and alighting on him like a dove. Coming out of his water baptism with a bird attached to him, Matthew's Jesus is led by this bird or spirit further into the wilderness to get himself ready to assume his sovereignty. Animality in these early chapters of Matthew appears positively as a herald and a guide. It is something close to or simply is divine and holy. Famished after fasting for 40 days and 40 nights in this liminal space, Matthew's Jesus himself seems to be in an animal state. He has no home, no food, no one to talk to except the devil. At the same time, he begins to demonstrate his sovereignty in the wilderness by rejecting the devil's 3 proposals. After this, we see Matthew's Jesus calling disciples and firmly establishes his sovereignty with his Sermon on the Mount. In addition, Matthew's Jesus will deliver 4 more long discourses to rival the Pentateuch and establish himself as the sovereign who lays down the new law. He also announces that what he says will take place and will never pass away. Third, let me talk about the animality or beastly sovereignty of Matthew's Jesus. In the well-known parable of the sheep and the goats, where Matthew's Jesus is presented as a shepherd who sits on the throne to judge all the nations, he pronounces that some, the sheep, will inherit the kingdom and receive eternal life, while others, the goats, will be sent away into eternal punishment. This parable makes clear that current inclusion in the community of Matthew's Jesus is not necessarily permanent, since everything cannot be known until a time of future judgment. Moreover, Matthew's Jesus states that the final judgment will come at an unexpected hour, and that no one except God will know on what day the Lord is coming. The shepherd, who is supposed to protect his flocks from the wolves, turned out to be another ravenous wolf in disguise, who can consume at any given moment some of those under his charge by separating them out as domesticated but condemned animals. 2 more animals appear in Matthew in what has traditionally been known as Matthew's Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, or what is arguably the greatest and most public celebration of his sovereignty. In a way that's rather mysterious or perhaps appropriate for a sovereign, he sends 2 disciples to untie and take a donkey and a colt without asking anyone for permission. He does, however, add that if anyone asks what they are doing, they should simply say, "The Lord needs them," and then they will be able to carry out his plan without obstruction. Sovereignty is beastly because of the sovereign's outlaw status. While animals are often viewed as below the law, the sovereign is above it. Here we see once again that the words of Matthew's Jesus come across as their own laws. He can take without asking, and his word can stop anyone from getting in his ways, even or especially when those words do not actually explain his or his disciples' action. What I want to zero in on is the ensuing circus act of Matthew's Jesus, riding on 2 different animals simultaneously to enter Jerusalem. As scholars have pointed out, Matthew does not seem to understand here that the Hebrew scripture he cites is Hebrew poetry. Since Hebrew poetry works by parallelism and not by rhyme, Zechariah chapter 9 verse 9 should not be taken literally as referring to 2 different animals. Instead of reading this passage as Matthew's mistake, I will argue that the message is revealing how Christ's sovereignty is dependent on animality. As Niccolo Machiavelli suggests in The Prince, in addition to keeping his promises as a human should, the sovereign must also have the strength of a lion and the cunning of a fox. A sovereign is then a human and animal hybrid, but also a chimera animal. This is precisely the picture of Matthew's sovereign Christ as he rides on 2 different animals in this crowning or clowning act. The coming together of beast and sovereign is perfectly and openly confessed by Matthew's sovereign Christ when he says about himself and the 2 animals, "The Lord needs them." Matthew's Christ needs all kinds of animals to be or to become Lord, who will in some unknown day and hour move in like a wolf to surprise his followers and all nations with his judgment. Finally, the stupidity or asininity of any assumption of superiority we have over animals or over other people, including the sovereign's claim of having power over life and death, is clearly shown in the reality of death. A dead person's body is inevitably at the mercy of others, even if one establishes a will before one's death. Joseph of Arimathea must ask Pilate's permission for the corpse of Matthew's Jesus, a request that Pilate has the authority to grant or refuse. Getting the green light from Pilate, Joseph makes the decision to wrap the corpse of Matthew's Jesus in a clean linen cloth and then bury the wrapped body in the tomb that Joseph has prepared for himself. We don't know if Joseph's action matched the desire of Matthew's sovereign Christ. Also, when Matthew's Jesus claims to have received all authority in heaven and on earth to send his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, is he not in effect transferring or dividing his sovereignty to multiple parties? Here is yet another case that the Lord needs them, just as a master or a king in his parables still needs slaves to collect the harvest, to invite people to or to kick people out of his banquet, to run his household, or to invest his property. We must remember that as a prayer of Matthew's Jesus in Gethsemane makes clear, his death is the result of God's will rather than his own. Similarly, the resurrection of his dead body is done by God, the ultimate other. Matthew's God is the sovereign behind Matthew's sovereign Christ, who alone knows when the final judgment will take place. Matthew's sovereign Christ is ushered onto the stage by animality, rules in beastly ways, and embodies animality in himself. When he moves and acts with followers calling him Lord, and he himself claiming sovereignty, he is ultimately not in control, and neither are we. Thank you.
Thank you, Benny. I thought we were in control, but I guess we are not. this problematizing of the sovereign and showing that the beastly side of it, I think, is something that we will come back to for our discussion. At this point, we were going to have poet Aruna Gogulamanda, who is Telugu from Andhra Pradesh in India, read her poem. I have the poem here, so apologies to Aruna, but I'll read it, and if I mess it up, apologies. But she explained that she penned this poem in agony, hearing the news that 2 Dalit children are burned to death at Haryana. So it's a voice of agony. I hope that I will be able to express. The title of the poem is "This is my country." This is my country of enormous history. Here, infants are burned alive for being born as Dalit heirs, beaten to death for singing their song of sorrowful lives. This is my country. This is my country that boasts of worshiping women, but brides are burned alive every single minute. Gang raped, kicked, pushed onto the streets, killed and burned like a heap of garbage. Paraded naked on the roads, their men are made to eat excreta and drink urine of castes' penises. Animals are made gods, planets and stars rule our lives. A poor man's food is snatched away from his plate, and he is lynched to death, for his food is made someone else's god. Footpaths bleed when a celebrity drunkard takes it for a racing road. The poor have no place here. They are ruthlessly driven to the outskirts, where whenever a white leader visits. This is my country. Alas, this is my country. Secular and democratic, but its subjects are heinously killed for eating their hard-earned morsels, walking their own way and living their own life in dire poverty on the fringes of the actual village. This is my country of rich heritage, of much talked about Vedas and Puranas, but fails to treat a human. This is my country of ancient philosophy built on Vanashrama Dharma, the doctrine of division and discrimination, of caste, religion, and gender. This is my country. And I think I'll end with the words of Aruna from her poem, and apologize to the audience, that this being an all-male panel. But 3 lines in Aruna's poem raises the question that we have been talking about, especially about color and class. And these 3 lines: poor has no place here. They are ruthlessly driven to the outskirts whenever a white leader visits. So when a white leader visits, they clean up the streets and move the poor away. And I think this about race and color and class still remains, and it's a struggle that we need to deal with. I mean, it's when a white leader comes to India, the poor are moved away. When someone like Raj goes to the British Isles, yeah, they push back rather than move away and give room for the brown migrant, the colored person to come in. So when we talk about hospitality, we need to rethink the complexity of this process. I said that I was going to end with Aruna's words, so I'm going to read it again. Poor has no place here. And this is my country. This is her country. Poor has no place here. They are ruthlessly driven to the outskirts whenever a white leader visits. I hope that's a troubling lines for us as we close this panel. And I want to say thank you to you, members of the panel, Raj, Benny, and Stephen, and Jim. And thanks to Aruna, I got a message from her that she was in a different meeting and was not able to join us. Thanks to the audience, we will have another one more session, and Zoom is gonna drop us in about 1 or 2 minutes, but you see the presenters, the name of the presenters there on chat. And I say good night, good afternoon, good morning to all of you, and we'll catch up again at the next session if you are available. Thank you.